Hi guys, hope you're all well. I'm doing something I haven't done before, which is create a video to give you some of my ideas. The reason I'm doing a video is I had this idea 3 months ago, or a conclusion I drew from what was happening in the world, and I didn't put it into an email because it was such an amount of information. I didn't actually know how to get it down on paper properly. So my presentation skills are better at presenting rather than sending an email. So here we are. I want to talk about what I have come to the conclusion of because of the pandemic and because of the way the world has dealt with the pandemic. But before that, I want to talk about interest rates. And in the last recession, the world printed an awful lot of money and it introduced it into the economies of quantitative easing. And for the life of me, I couldn't understand why that didn't result in inflation. Why inflation didn't kick off and that should result in interest rates. And why does interest rates? So when you have bigger demand for goods and services, like demand for anything, there's one simple law in economics, the law of supply and demand. If demand goes up, the price usually goes up as well. So why didn't products and services go up when all this money was introduced into the world? And there's a few reasons for it, but one of the main reasons, which I've only really come to the conclusion of, is as follows. 15 years ago, when money was introduced, say the butcher got the money first. You spent your money with the butcher. The butcher spent his money then with the publican. The publican then maybe spent his money with the local shop, the draper. The draper then might have gone and spent the money in, say, the local supermarket. And it would make its way around, and eventually that money made its way to the multinational. And the multinational was basically taking it out of this circle. So the money was gone out of the circle, right? So, but that same, we'll call it, that same €100, would say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spends. There was actually 6 spends. So €100 was a €600 spend in the economy. Okay, so that created demand for goods and services, and that pushed the price of goods and services up. And we'll call it the consumer price index went up. That means that introduced interest rates to reduce that inflation. And interest rates is just the sucking of money out of an economy to cool it down. So when money goes back to a central bank, that money ceases to exist. So it just pulls money out, and it means, okay, calm the thing down so the prices of things don't shoot up too much. And normally, with the amount of money that has been injected into the economies of the world, we should have a huge amount of this, okay? There should be a massive amount of this. But one thing that has happened in the last number of years is the route between the large multinational and the consumer has shortened dramatically. So the cycle, I call this the cycle of money. The money is cycled around several times. Now, let's call this multinational for all intents and purposes. We'll call it Amazon is the big boy, okay? Now, Joe Bloggs gets €100. Say the pandemic payment, €350. If you talk to any postman in the country, it's like Christmas Day or Christmas week for the last 7 or 8 months, okay? Now, when he gets his €350, he goes directly online, he spends it with Amazon, okay? So this man doesn't get it, this man doesn't get it, this man doesn't get it, this man doesn't get it. And we're not talking about all the money, but a big chunk of money now is spent online. So it's completely bypassing all these people. So now you get €350. Let's just say we'll give an extreme example where it's all spent. Now, instead of having 6 times €350, all we have is €350 and it's gone. What does Amazon do? So these guys here spend most of their money on providing employment, paying for their business, running their families. Amazon does that all. The amount of money they need to run compared to what they make is so small. The rest of it is all profit, and it goes into a big pot. Okay, and it goes into the pot of the people who own it. Let's call Jeff Bezos as an example, right? So Jeff Bezos, the percentage of the money Amazon makes that he needs to live on is so small. He's incredibly efficient compared to these guys, who spend a large chunk of their money providing for their family, providing for their employees, providing for their business, or providing for their communities. So large companies are acting like huge interest rates. They don't have huge interest rates, but these huge companies are acting like interest rates. They are sucking money out. Whereas before, I call this a funnel. The funnel of money going from the populace down to the mega wealthy was like this. So it swirled around here a bit before it ended up coming down here. The swirls are less. Now, the swirls are like this. The channel has got so much narrower that money is floating from the people to the wealthy incredibly quickly, falls straight down to them, okay? So interest rates are a massive negative for investments. So now, if we can come to the conclusion, we already have interest rates, but they're in a different form, that means there's no need for other interest rates. That means interest rates are not going to go up. I actually think we may not see interest rates in our lifetimes. Leaving aside, now is the fact that countries of the world can't afford interest rates. The countries of the world, or the predominant countries of the world, have borrowed so much money, they actually can't afford interest rates to go up. So people say, oh, how will we pay this back? We won't be paying it back, but we do have to service our debt. And when interest rates are at zero, it costs practically nothing to service our debt. But if interest rates went up to 2 or 3%, the countries of the world have a huge, huge problem. A huge amount of their tax would have to go towards servicing their debt. And that can't happen either. So there's going to be no political will to push up interest rates. And there's also a quasi-interest rates act in here. So instead of the money, though, ceasing to exist, so when money goes back to a central bank, it ceases to exist. It's not. It's just going into these huge investment pots. So we haven't had inflation in the consumer price index, but we have had inflation, and that has happened hugely in investment assets. Okay? So my big fear all along was, look, interest rates will have to kick in at some stage if we have inflation, and then investment assets, particularly shares, will have to drop in price dramatically. I actually think that fear is gone. There might be momentary reductions in the share price, but over the medium term, pretty much all shares are going to increase in value on a percentage basis, right? So really, the outlook for all investment assets looks pretty good. But that's not the reason of this video. So I think, yes, there are some that carry a little bit more risk than others. I'll give you an example. US stocks have a little bit of risk now. If Biden is in, if Biden wins, if the Democrats win the 2 Senate seats that are coming up in January, there's a likelihood he can bring in his tax reforms that he wants to undo Trump's tax stuff, and he might try and tackle, Elizabeth Warren said she wants to tackle the big tech companies, which really has to happen. This has to stop, or else the world is in an awful position. So those mega tech companies and US stocks carry some risk. I still think European equities are still good value, even though they've risen the best part of 15% in the last 3 weeks. I still think there's more to go there, and that's where we're putting our clients who want to make, make a reasonable return on money. But there is one thing I want to talk to you about: shares and traditional assets. Shares and traditional investment assets have fundamentals. They have intrinsic value. So I'll give you, let's take a share, for example. A share price is a function of its profit, its innovation, the type of business it is, its risk, its management, its amount of employees, all that type of stuff. So there's fundamentals that tell you whether a share is good value or it's cheap or expensive. Okay, so there's fundamentals in it. So like a PE ratio is one fundamental, whereas a share is valued. So the earnings of a company might be 1 million, and if the shares are, say, traded 20 million, that's a 20 to 1 PE ratio. Give it a crazy one. Amazon is traded about 130 to 1. So there's 130 times its earnings, its shares are trading. And so it should take 130 years to get that back. So that might sound expensive, but Amazon has this behemoth that has all this potential growth built into and all that type of stuff. And I always invested in assets that had fundamentals and intrinsic value. So I'd always have, or at least worst case scenario, the market corrects, at least there's a value to the asset I own. And I've always lived by that, but I'm actually going to break it now, because they are holding assets back in an environment where the world is awash with money. I mean, the world is absolutely awash with money. It's very unequally distributed, but it is awash with money. The fundamentals of all the investment assets, property, there's only so much rent you can get. Bonds have their own fundamentals, shares. The one that doesn't is gold. There's no real fundamental to gold. It's a pure supply and demand product. So the value of gold isn't backed up by what you can do with it. It's actually way more than the value of what you can do with it is. But gold is one asset that you might say, well, has no fundamentals to it. But we have a world where just there's huge demand for investment. And when you look at all the assets that, say, shares, and you say, okay, they're quite dear, you start looking somewhere and say, hey, equate to a farmer going to the market. Say he wants to buy 10 cattle, and he has 10 prime cattle picked out, but they all go too expensive on him. Well, then he goes looking at the next tier of cattle, right? And I believe hugely, this 3 months ago I really believed this, and I still believe it, that assets that have no fundamentals, that just become pure supply and demand products, as in there's no intrinsic value, it doesn't do anything other than people want it. And that means there's no way of saying this is too dear, this is too cheap. And in an environment where there's huge demand, the price tag just keeps going up and up and up and up. And the one I want to talk to you about very, very quickly is cryptocurrency. And I stayed away from cryptocurrency all through the last number of years, even though it was said to me several times, because I said this thing has no value. It's not a currency. Forget about it as a currency. It's never going to be a currency in my mind, particularly Bitcoin, which is the one I'm going to talk to you about. It's an investment asset. But because it had no use, I felt, Jesus, if interest rates was to go up or blah, 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 this thing would just collapse. And to a degree, that's right in some stage in the future, maybe. But in an environment where it looks like there's going to be no interest rate increases for years, and the world is awash with money, and all other investment assets are dear when you compare them to their fundamentals, Bitcoin to me makes perfect sense all of a sudden. And I equate it to nearly like gravy on a plate. There's so much gravy on the plate, and bread, we call them shares, for soaking up the gravy. There's not enough bread in the world to soak up all the gravy. We need something else. But we need something that at any one time you can't say, God, this is crazily expensive. Whereas Bitcoin, you can't tell whether Bitcoin is expensive or not. It's only to do with demand and supply. So there's a limited supply of Bitcoin. It's the oldest and most established of the cryptocurrencies. It doesn't have a use, is my opinion. It does not have a use, but there's huge demand. Now, one thing that I want to point out to you, I know this video is going on a bit, so I want to wrap it up. This is the history of Bitcoin's price. All right, we're back up here today. This point here was actually, it's much more steep than that. I came up really quick. At this time, back in a number of years ago, I stayed away from it. It was a fad. There was every Tom, Dick and Harry and Joe on the street was buying Bitcoin. And one of the things that tells you whether it's a fad or not is Google searches went through the roof for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. Everyone was buying them, and everyone was buying a small amount, but a huge amount of people buying things pushed the price up, and the price went up. Then when people realised, God, there's not much use for this thing, and the reason they were buying it was not because of they actually understood what was maybe happening, it was just purely a fad, the price fell dramatically, and people lost their shirts out. This time here though, the price is back up to where it was roughly. Google searches haven't gone up at all. I mean, they haven't budged. It means, although that will come, but at this moment in time, it's the big investors, it's the fund managers, it's the ultra wealthy that are starting to plow money into Bitcoin. Bitcoin, when I had this idea, was trading at 8,000 per unit, it's at 19,000 today, and people say, oh, I've missed the boat. I actually don't believe, and I don't hold me accountable for this, but I don't believe that's the case. I believe you can see Bitcoin trading at 100,000 per Bitcoin within 12 months, maybe more. And it's to do with the sheer volume of money, the sheer desire not to have money sitting on deposit because it's negative interest rates. And the people who have money have so much of it, they don't mind taking a punt with a good chunk of that money to try and make money. Here's my prediction. With shares, you will make a decent percentage return for the next 12 to 18 months. I believe the world's heading into a boom now. And I've changed my opinion. I was fearful that we're heading into a recession. That has passed in my mind. We're actually heading into a boom. Once we have this thing sorted out by Easter, already we're in a boom because people spending left, right and centre. But I think we're going to see a major boom from Easter on for maybe 18 months. I think you'll make a decent percentage return on shares, okay? Bitcoin or crypto, we'll call it Bitcoin because that's what I'll be buying. I think you will make a multiple of your money. So instead of 30%, you'll make 300%, you'll make 3 times your money. That's my prediction. It's based on all the observations I've looked at, it's based upon the trends, the articles I've read. As I said, I stayed away from this because it had no intrinsic value. But the intrinsic value is holding other assets back now because there's just too much money in the world. There's actually just too much money looking for a home. And the only home that's left are assets that have no intrinsic values. So there's nothing to hold it back. There's nothing to say, God, the risk associated here is pure supply and demand. I'm set up a Zoom meeting with a techie guy who knows how to buy it, trade it, knows what it is, and store it. If you'd like to be included in that Zoom meeting, just as an observer to see how that works out, please send me a private message. I know this week this has gone on a bit. It was pretty much impossible for me to put all this information into an email. That's why I've created a video. Summary. I don't see us having interest rate increases for the next number of years. That means all investment assets will increase in value because demand will be huge. All this money flows out of the economies far quicker than ever before, and it flows to the wealthy. What do the wealthy do? They spend a much smaller proportion of their money on living and a much higher proportion on investment. investment assets are dear, and the fundamentals of investment assets says they're dear. So they're going to be looking for fundamental assets that have no, sorry, they're going to be looking for investment assets that have no fundamentals, that are pure supply and demand assets. That's where I think your Bitcoin's going to come in. Maybe gold as well, but because of its history, it does have some fundamentals attached to it. As I say, I think shares, particularly some shares, will do quite well. I think you're looking at a percentage increase, but if you want to take a punt on something that I think you're going to make a multiple, so several 100% return, I think you're looking at cryptocurrencies, but in particular Bitcoin. Come back to me and I'll include you in the Zoom meeting with the techie guy. Thank you, and so, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.